Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Got an exciting guest this week, Bart Frazier, our very own program director here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. Bart, welcome to the show.
Well, it's good to be here after all this time.
All right, well, a couple weeks ago, we were talking on the show about eminent domain in the context of the Kelo case, where the government took land from private individuals and took houses from people in order to transfer it to big, powerful, influential corporation. Well, that gave rise to an article that you wrote several years ago about Shenandoah National Park and how eminent domain abuse played a role in the creation of that park. So I thought, we ought to go back and revisit that article and revisit the principles that took place in the creation of that national park to give people another dimension of eminent domain abuse. Because as you point out in that article, I mean, it was just horrendous what they did in the creation of that national park. So why don't I kick it back to you and tell us a little bit about what the article was about, give us a little bit of background on it, and then we can go into more details in a bit.
Well, it was actually the Kelo case that, kind of sparked my interest in it. And I was familiar with the founding of the park and the use of eminent domain in the founding of the park through my family. My family had been living out near Shenandoah National Park for many years, although we're not from there, but we'd been there a long time. And I'm an avid hiker and outdoorsman and camper. And, the locals out there have a really strong understanding of the park there. There's still a lot of relatives, the descendants of the people who lived there when the park was founded. And so the people around there, they know about the park, and I knew through the people around there. And, the founding of the park was probably one of the very first cases in the United States where such a large area of land where had been confiscated through eminent domain by any government. Now, in this case, it was the state government. It was actually the federal government was willing to establish a national park there, but they actually refused to obtain the property themselves, and they kicked it back to the states. And Virginia was all too happy to do it. And unfortunately, it's actually a case of it's not really a case of the state being this evil organization and coming in and swooping up this property. It was actually instigated by Virginians themselves. It was residents of the Shenandoah Valley and businessmen on the other side, on the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountain, who were interested in attracting tourists to the area, and it was these people who instigated the state to come and take the property, and that's what they did. This was 1926 when this act was passed, and it was not long after that the state of Virginia passed legislation to use eminent domain to take the park. And they did it. They kicked off about 450 different families, totaling a hair under 3,000 people, many of whom had to be removed forcibly. And it's a travesty, just like any case of eminent domain normally is. And they're feeling the repercussions of it today. The park is still trying to come to terms with its history and how it was founded.
Yeah, it was my understanding, and you have much better familiarity with the history of the national parks than I do, but it's my understanding that many of the other parks had been donated to the government by wealthy people who own the land and thought that this would be a good way to conserve it and share it with others and so forth. But this one was different, Shenandoah, it seems to me, because it was all privately owned from what I can tell. And the federal government, as you point out, says, hey, we're not going to take the property from people, so you all will have to do it. And I found that an interesting twist in your article where it was the local residents or a select group of local residents that saw an economic opportunity here through the government taking over this property, specifically through tourism. And so they get this law passed by the state of Virginia that authorizes the state to use eminent domain for public use. And that concept of public use, it seems to me originally was like if the government needs the property for a military base or a courthouse, that the original founders of Virginia and the federal government said, oh, well, here's a way for the government to do that. But the idea of just taking somebody's property or many people's property because it happens to be beautiful and because people want everyone to share that, I find that particularly repulsive. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, obviously, I do. But, I think even back then there were many people who were uneasy with this. I mean, the federal government today would have absolutely no qualms about using eminent domain to take whatever it wanted for just about any use it wanted. So the fact that it wouldn't even touch this, that it kicked it back down to the state, is kind of indicative of the feelings at the time. And like you alluded to, you're correct. Most of the national parks, if not all the national parks at that time, had been established in the West. The Rockies, Yellowstone, Grand Teton, and the parks, before they were parks, were either owned wholeheartely by the federal government. They'd simply never been claimed, or they, like you said, they were donated. I believe it was Rockefeller, one of the big magnates from the late 19th century, donated all the property for Grand Teton National Park. And he thought he was doing a public service. I mean, of course he was. I wish he'd established the park himself and had not given it to the national government. But that's the way it was established. There was really no precedent for this. Now, Smoky Mountain National Park, it's actually along the same mountain range to the south of Shenandoah, was established in a similar fashion to Shenandoah and at about the same time. I'm not as familiar with how they went about, the numbers and the legal hurdles that they had to go over, but it was the same deal, and they faced the same problem. In the East, you had many, many more people living here. Back then, just as today, the big concentration of the population in the United States was on the East Coast. Actually, even more so back then than it is today. And people were pining for a big national park like Yellowstone, like Yosemite, where they could leave, not have to drive too far, and experience the wonders of nature that people out in the West had access to. There's nothing like that on the East Coast. Well, they really had no choice but to take it from somebody, because all the land here, everything east of the Mississippi for the most part, is owned privately. And that's the choice that they were left with. And now, of course, this is when progressivism was really feeling its roots, and they had the power, and this was, the feelings of the time. Here you have all these businessmen who had no qualms about, taking the land from their neighbors, running these people off the mountain, and for their own benefit. And I think that it was just a sign of the times. But it was how the United States has evolved culturally since then. It's how we find ourselves where we are today with, the quasi-socialist system that we have. And it's just a direct result, and it's not surprising, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with you that here was the start of the progressive era, and the notion of the public good and the good of society. And I mean, I find it appalling that they would see private property that was beautiful, that was natural, that was owned by private people, and say, well, it's just not fair that those private owners should be the only ones enjoying it, so we're going to effectively nationalize their property. We'll pay them off a little bit. I just find that appalling. I mean, there's big ranches in Texas where I'm from, like the King Ranch. I mean, most people have never been on the King Ranch, and I have no doubts it's a beautiful ranch. But I would be shocked if all of a sudden somebody says, hey, let's have a public easement onto the King Ranch so that everybody that wants to go enjoy it, visit it, they're free to do so. Or you brought
Don't
up
give anybody ideas.
You're right. Well, you brought up a couple of days with me ago about that Wagner Ranch in Texas. What was the deal on that? The second largest in the country or in the state?
Second largest behind King, yes. Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is both of those ranches are actually larger in size. As large as Shenandoah it is, both of those ranches are considerably larger than Shenandoah National Park. They're huge, but they're privately owned.
Yeah, well,
it's fantastic.
Yeah, well, it puts it in perspective that here are private owners that are the only ones who get to share the benefits of these beautiful ranches or anybody they invite on. And in Texas, sure enough, ranchers, they lease out their hunting rights to people who want to hunt. And I mean, that's the whole private property order. And yet here, this mindset, this progressive mindset comes along, which I call it a socialist mindset that says, we can just take it from you, because we want to enjoy it. We want society to enjoy it. I find it so shocking. And here, Bart, we also saw the real harsh reality of government. I mean, we libertarians always say government is force. And sometimes people don't understand that. Now, would you tell us a little bit about the families that were on there and what their reaction to this whole process was, and what the government's reaction to their reaction was?
Well, sure. Well, to start off, to get back to, the motivation of the people, this was, the progressive era was really, chugging along right now. So that was part of it, the will of the majority trying to come in and provide this good, for everybody. But there was another more insidious aspect to it, and that was that the mountain people, the people who lived there were considered backwards hicks who needed to be civilized. So there were actually some people who felt that they were doing these people a favor by running them off the mountain and civilizing them, teaching them nutrition and proper education and, teaching them about, progressivism for that matter. And they actually set up most of these people in houses if they chose to. So, yes, that was part of it. So you had them coming in and telling them this was for their own good. Some people actually, with open arms took this chance. They saw it as an opportunity to get off the mountain, because there was a lot of poverty up there, and some people, took advantage of it. But most people took it grudgingly, and some people didn't take it at all. There was a small percentage of people who flat out refused to get off the mountain. And there was actually one resident there who took it to the Supreme Court. He fought it on 14th Amendment grounds in federal court. The federal appeals court ruled against him, and then the Supreme Court refused to hear it. So it did make it that far. It didn't do him any good, unfortunately. So they weren't the backwards hits that these people thought. I mean, here's a man who's taking them, fighting them in the courts. But other people just flat out refused to leave. The most famous was a man who owned a gas station on top of the mountain. His family had lived there. He'd been there with his wife for 35 years. And when the sheriff showed up, he thought they were coming to fill up with gas, and he came out to say hi. And they cuffed him when he came out. And he said he refused to go, and then when they started dragging him literally by hand and foot to put him in the back of the patrol car, he started singing the Star-Spangled Banner as they threw him in the car and took him off down the mountain. There was another case of a man who owned a business. He had a spring on his property on the mountain, and he bottled the water and sold it to anybody who wanted to buy it. And they came to his house. They took all of his belongings out of his house, his chairs, his tables, all of his furniture, all of his belongings, piled them up in front of his home and set his house on fire. Oh, no, I'm sorry. They tore his chimney down so he couldn't heat his house in the wintertime, so there was no choice for him to leave. And then there's another case of a woman who was 5 months pregnant who refused to go. She told them to take a hike. It was her property, and this was unconstitutional. They yanked her out of her house and burned it down to the ground. So that's what it came down to. The last holdouts refused to go. It was, the sharp end of the stick. These people really saw, that government is force, and that's what eminent domain is, and that's how these parks unfortunately were founded. So how they were founded. So it is it's a travesty, and these people still remember this. There are meetings that go on annually today of the descendants of these people who can keep these stories alive.
Yeah, here was the brute force of government, which you described perfectly. I mean, this is, you say the sharp end of the stick. I say the point of the sword. I mean, this is government in action. This is what happens if you refuse. And let's face it, if these people had refused violently with guns, like at Ruby Ridge, they would have, in the protection of their homes, they would have been killed. And they would have been, the excuse would have been resisting arrest. And so here was real government in action. I mean, burning a guy's house down in front of him so that he has no place to go, or burning a woman's house who's pregnant in front of her. So, hey, here, where are you going to go tonight, lady? I mean, that's just brutal. And yeah, it's interesting. And that was an interesting part of your article where you said that people haven't forgotten. The descendants know exactly what happens. But the other twist to this, as you point out in your article, is that the Park Service tried to keep this secret for a long time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, why wouldn't they? I mean, it was, a horrible way, it was not something you want to showcase as part of your brand new, beautiful park, sure. But they have actually been coming to grips with this in the past couple of years. There's actually a display there at the park now with some of the history of the people that did live there. They didn't even acknowledge that people lived there before. It was almost like it was always this pristine wilderness. But the historians that are there now are coming to a little bit of grips with that. And there are some historians digging into it now too as well. I actually was able to access, when I wrote my article, a nice little compendium of articles that are put together by the local newspaper out there in Rappahannock County, which is in Virginia, just to the east of the park, and some other scholars are doing some work too. So it's a good thing that people are acknowledging this. I mean, I doubt there's ever going to be any kind of reparations or anything like this. I would say privatize the park. Just at least give it back. Get rid of it. But that's where we are.
Yeah, there's absolutely no reason why private companies or conservatorships or trusteeships or whatever could not establish parks. Like, there's absolutely no reason that government needs to be doing it. But there's also, you mentioned that there's more public awareness. There's a lady that recently wrote a book on this, right?
Right, Sue Eisenfeld. Right. Yeah, she has a book, was Shenandoah, A Story of Conservation and Betrayal is the name of her book, which I highly recommend. It's excellent. She's not a libertarian, so it's not a libertarian take on it, but I will say that she did give at least an objective, showing of what went on in the park. She was an avid hiker there. She'd been going there for decades, and she made it her hobby to kind of explore off trail and go to all these old homes. There's not much left, some foundations and some chimneys and things like that. But it piqued her curiosity as to what these people were like. And so she went on this big research project, which then turned into this book. So anybody who's really curious about the history of the park, I couldn't recommend her book more highly. It's excellent.
Yeah. Before I forget, what was the title of your article?
Eminent Domain. You have to. It's on the website. If you Google Shenandoah and Bart Fraser, it comes right up.
Okay, that's at fff.org. And,
right, at fff.org.
Yeah, in fact, I saw another book that it was published several years ago where a lady compiled many of the letters that landowners wrote the federal government. Apparently both before the taking and after the taking, and then she puts them into context. And she made the same point you did, that everybody, or federal officials and state officials and the people that were behind this taking, referred to these people as ignorant hillbillies and rednecks, and that they, it's sort of like they don't really count. They're just like refuse or, garbage. And so it was no big deal that they got thrown off, or that they were, as you pointed out, doing it in their interest. But the lady that published this compilation of letters said, look beyond the grammar and the illiteracy, and you can see that these people are very intelligent. They may not be able to write very well or speak very well, but that doesn't mean they're not smart in terms of what their rights are and understanding the importance of private property and a man's castle, a home is his castle, and so forth. And so it is encouraging that people were fighting these things. I mean, I agree with you. I can understand why the Park Service would want to keep it secret and wouldn't want to be advertising this. But to me, it's a real testament to the spirit of the American people that they were standing up against really what amounts to tyranny. And among the pictures I've seen, you're right about the castle. I mean, the chimneys are there and the foundations, and hikers go and check those out sometimes. But one of the most fascinating ones was this series of tractor seats up on the side of a mountain. Have you ever seen that photograph?
No, I never did, but I believe it.
Yeah,
I mean, I've been back in Shenandoah, and there's stuff everywhere. I mean, there's stuff all throughout the back of the park there. There's cemeteries all throughout Shenandoah. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, that's fascinating, the cemeteries. Well, the tractor seats were for people that just wanted to sit there and enjoy the sights, the mountain view and so forth. And it was just awesome. I mean, it personalizes what was happening here. Well, how much do you know about the highway, though, the Blue Ridge Parkway? Was that part of this project, or was that something different? Or
No, that's something different. That actually, the main road that goes to Shenandoah National Park is Skyline Drive. It connects with the Blue Ridge Parkway to the south. But I would have to imagine, just as all highways are in general, to be honest with you, that was established by eminent domain as well. And that goes all the way down through the Smoky Mountain National Park, and all through the south. I mean, it's a huge thing, but it really did not have anything to do with Shenandoah as a separate project.
So it's on a different piece of property? It doesn't go through Shenandoah National Park?
No. It actually it connects with it, but in Shenandoah National Park, the road that winds through Shenandoah National Park is Skyline Drive. Okay. And so it's completely different. But same idea. Big, beautiful road that curves through the mountain passes with all these beautiful, overlooks. And same deal, kick everybody off so everybody has a nice drive and can look at the fall leaves and take pretty pictures. But yeah, same deal.
Yeah, I remember seeing a sign when I was on a hike in Shenandoah once where it said something that described the Blue Ridge Parkway as this silver sliver of beauty extending through the mountains. All I could think about was, this is an asphalt road. It's the ugliest thing in the world. It defaced a beautiful mountain. I mean, this is nonsense. But it really goes to show how people extol the government. The government's like their God, and whatever it does, it's just wonderful. And in fact, I can't help but think, as we're talking about this, is of Robert Moses, the master builder in New York, that was using the eminent domain with the same mindset, booting people out of neighborhoods that had been there forever, poor people that had established intricate relations with each other. And Moses has this better view of what society should be like, and we got to get rid of this blight. And so he goes in there and uses eminent domain to throw these people out of their homes, send them along their way, give them a little bit of money, and ends up producing these horrendous sections of the city. And of course, nobody ever knows what's happened to the people that he threw out in the neighborhood that lived in those intricate neighborhoods.
Well, it's the same deal where, eminent domain is used anywhere. I mean, Robert Moses is one of the most extreme examples. And if for anybody watching this who hasn't read The Power Broker, which is, a biography of Robert Moses, couldn't recommend it more. It's fantastic. Tragic from a libertarian standpoint, but it's a real study in power. I mean, he affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people with highways, parks as well. I mean, this is another use of eminent domain for parks and public use. But it's been abused all over the country. I mean, there's famous cases of Pole Town in Detroit where General Motors needed a new plant, and the city just came in and wiped out an entire neighborhood for the benefit of one corporation. And then, of course, the famous case of Kilo back, I believe, in 2006, where a piece of property is being used just to hand it over to another business to develop. I mean, it's a horrible affront to individual liberty, certainly property rights. But as far as parks go, I mean, I am a conservationist. I'm a libertarian, but I consider myself a conservationist. And, there is definitely a way to do this, and that is private parks. And it's not just some pie-in-the-sky dream, because private parks do exist, and large parks exist. One example is Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in eastern Pennsylvania. It's almost 3,000 acres. It's been there since the 1930s. It's completely private. It's run as a nonprofit. And people, particularly bird watchers, as you might imagine, flock to it. From all over the East Coast to come and hike its trails and to watch the birds come by, watch the fantastic hawk migration in the fall. And that is, no eminent domain was used there. Nobody's rights were violated in the establishment of Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And there's no reason that couldn't work elsewhere. I mean, the Nature Conservancy, they're a prime example of this right now. I mean, they're not perfect from a libertarian standpoint, but they certainly use many consensual forms of contract to establish, not so much parks, but sanctuaries, and to protect different areas. And that is a model that should be followed. I mean, every libertarian should be happy about that model of conservation, putting our money where our mouth is, either by paying user fees or donating land. And that's the way a free society works. That is how, private individuals, without, stealing their neighbor's property, can get these beautiful places.
So how's that private park work in Pennsylvania? Do people pay to access it, or is it just open to the public? The one with the hawks? You there, Bart? Hey, Bart, you hearing me?
I am now.
Okay, we blanked out there for a minute. How does that park work where people go to see the hawks and the bird watchers? Do people pay to get there onto there, or is it?
Oh, absolutely.
So you pay an admission price?
Yes. Yeah. Well, you either pay a daily price, or there's a lot of members there, and they're a nonprofit, so they ask for help. People fund it, so they have bequests and donations, but it's all consensual, private exchange, and that's the model that we should be following here. It is, it's beautiful, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's a real testament. And if you look at any privately owned property, they're always better taken care of than the government-owned property. I mean, everybody knows that. And in fact, in some of these areas like the Nature Conservancy, my understanding is that they even work with oil companies to drill on their property. And they make sure that
absolutely.
The drilling only takes place when the birds are not flocking in a seasonal manner, and so that they don't scare the birds and so forth. But then, so you have this perfect partnership with the royalties from the oil revenues funding the operation, enabling them to go out and get new property. And like you say, it's a testament to how a private property free market order operates.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, even that's one great example. I believe it's called the Leaky Tract that they own down in Louisiana. But they've actually flat out sold property that was bequested to them. I know of one case where a beautiful piece of property, waterfront property in Hawaii, was given to the Nature Conservancy, and they decided that the best use for that property was to sell it. They just flat out sold it. And this was to further their own goals of conserving, endangered species or ecosystems, whatever. And this piece of property, as pretty as it was, didn't fit that model. It was a nice piece of property, but it wasn't really conserving anything per se, but it was very, very valuable. So they sold that piece of property for many millions of dollars and were able to use the funds from that to then go and purchase other properties that, would either, conserve, help protect a rare bird species or a particular ecosystem. And it's the marshaling of private resources. And you just don't see that with the government. You never see that with it. Actually, quite the opposite. You look at particularly national forests. National parks have a little bit of a different mission than the national forests do. Even national parks are run down. I mean, their facilities are always worn. They're always not taken care of. They're always begging for more resources. But the national forests are even worse because they're deemed multi-use properties, and they certainly are multi-used. I mean, people come in, it's really handouts for big corporations, logging, mineral rights, you name it. I mean, it's the benefit for corporations to be able to come in and get resources without the risk of having to own the property yourself. So it's a big sham, if you ask me. And, you know, another case just to sell it off. You know, nature conservancy model, absolutely.
Yeah, well, and I guarantee you, no Texas rancher is ever going to let a guest on his ranch or a guy who's exercising some hunting rights there mess with his property. And even when they allow oil companies come in and drill, they're real careful to make sure that oil company leaves the condition of the ranch in perfect, pristine condition. That's what private ownership does. Why don't we wrap it up with your feelings about eminent domain itself? Because you ended up your article by saying that it was a tyrannical use of government power. What do you think about it?
Absolutely. I mean, eminent domain really is an affront to individual liberty. I mean, there really aren't for one thing, there aren't many public use opportunities for the government. There really aren't. I mean, private enterprise can take care of just about anything. And if the government really feels it needs property for whatever reason it has, it should be forced to pay market price just like everybody else does. No big fist of government come in and, you know, smash the little man just because it's easy. It's an individual right, it's an inviolable right, and eminent domain should never be used.
Yeah, I find it fascinating that the power to exercise eminent domain, as far as I understand it, was not among the enumerated powers of the federal government. The first time it was mentioned was in the Bill of Rights, which was talking about that sort of if you use eminent domain, you got to use it for public use. But I agree with you. I don't think you need the power at all. That if government wants a piece of property, I think they ought to pay whatever the owner wants or don't buy it. You know, that if the owner wants more than what is considered market value, that's his right. That's his property. And if the government wants to build a courthouse there and the guy doesn't want to sell, well, then you go find another place that'll sell to you. But I really don't think you need eminent domain at all. I agree with you. I think it's just a tyrannical use of power. And look how it's extended away from buying the property for the courthouse over to buying the property for big corporations, kicking people off their property for the good of society with national parks and so forth. I say ditch it all. Anyway, that's the show for this week. Bart, it's good to have you on the show.
It was fun.
All right, we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.